And to help me unpack more of what started in that awakening, I'm going to ask Dr. Jeff Myers to come on up. How's it going, Dr. Jeff?
It's great, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for having me over here tonight.
I'm so glad we get to do this. We never got to do anything like this before.
We never got to do this, but you have a lot of friends who are here.
They are good friends.
I think it just shows how much you invest in the lives of people that they wanted to come out and be a part of this tonight. So I'm happy to be a part of it as well.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Awesome. Well, Dr. Jeff is going to help us unpack the New Age worldview. And like I said, in that Boomer Awakening is when New Age kind of started to, not so much began, but started to get a foothold in the fabric of America. Now, what is interesting, and this may shock you, I hope it does, honestly, is that 2 out of 3 Christians who attend church hold some New Age belief. And that goes as far as not just believing something like, oh yeah, you know, our spirits are made of energy or light or something like that. It goes as far as actively using tarot cards, practicing something Wiccan, like worshiping trees, even involves astrology, things like that. And so the New Age worldview has really infiltrated our church. And I love in your book, Secret Battles, where you talk about viruses. And that's what I think of when I think of the New Age worldview. And so my first question that I'd love to ask you is, New Age seems to serve as a giant trip to the supermarket to pull off the shelves what we like about religion and avoid what we dislike. Where do New Age ideas come from?
Aaron, thank you for the question. And it's interesting, our study that we did with the Barna Research Group found the same thing, that most Christians strongly agree with the law of karma. They strongly agree that God is a force, not a person. I mean, these things that you just think, how could that have ever gotten into the minds and the hearts of believers? But the backdrop of this is the secularization of the United States of America, which came on the heels of the Enlightenment. The secular worldview says only the material world exists. There is no spirit, there's no God, there's no Jesus, there's no heaven, no hell, no angels, no demons. All of that stuff is made up. Okay? Only the material world exists. And then you have people coming along saying, well, maybe it's exactly the opposite of that, right? So this is the counterpoint. So what I call new spirituality, and there are different terms for it: new spirituality, New Age, higher consciousness, different things like that. But it actually takes the opposite viewpoint, that it's not where the secularist says only the material world exists, the spiritual world is an illusion. The new spiritualist says the spiritual world is what really exists, the physical world is an illusion. And the temptation for Christians in the church goes way, way back. I think it goes all the way back to an early ancient heresy called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was the idea that there's more than one God. Okay, there's a good God who's sort of the God of everything that's out there, and then there's a demiurge, a bad God who created this world. So the goal of life is to escape this world and then reunite with God, the real, true, good God who is out there someplace. And it leaks into our songs. I mean, every time we sing songs about, this world has nothing for me, that kind of a thing, you see this worldview leaking back in a little bit to say what really matters, what's really important is spiritual, not material.
Wow.
And this is something that, the early church fathers dealt with this, but you know how they dealt with it? They wrote the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. Look at the Apostles' Creed, and it is a line-by-line refutation of the Gnostic doctrine, that Jesus came in the flesh to earth, to a world that God actually created. And I think somehow in this period in history, people are really tempted to just say, look, my world's not working out that great. It hurts. My job's not all that satisfying. I'm not finding all of these. So the real truth, the real satisfaction must be out there someplace.
Wow. So let me follow up that question with, was having a conversation, who's an acquaintance, he's a Hindu priest up in Castle Rock, and while he and I were talking, he said something that I found very interesting. He said, Westerners, those of us who live in America, we don't really understand how Eastern thought works, that they see, that Easterners just think of the world completely different the way that we do. And when he said it got me thinking that maybe that's why like Eastern religion and the New Age looks so much different over here than it does in like in India or Southeast Asia. And I was wondering if you could just speak into that a little bit, like maybe who are some of the key figures that kind of drive this ideology.
Well, if you look on the list of the top 10 spiritual teachers in our age, you would have people like Rick Warren would be on the list, Joe Osteen would be on the list, but several of the main characters on that list are Oprah Winfrey, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra, and these are people who teach. They take that basic idea that the spiritual world is what really exists. The material world is an illusion, and they build their entire perspective on that. But then again, it's individualistic. But America's individualistic. I think one of the early movements in America was the Transcendentalist movement, which was you understand truth not by looking outside of yourself, but by looking inside of yourself.
Yes.
Through personal introspection, you're going to find the truth. It's just as individualistic as anything else, but it's inward focused rather than outward focused. And things like that happen in a nation doesn't escape that sort of heritage, even if it goes on generation after generation after generation. So we believe that everything is individualistic. You go to church, you don't hear about the body of Christ as much as you hear about, do you have Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, right? This is about you going to heaven when you die. And a lot of people are saying these days, well, if it's about me, then why should I be there? Because it would be a lot more fun to be with myself boating than to be with myself sitting in church. Right? Well, it's actually Colorado. It's not that fun to boat here, but you get the basic idea. And I wonder sometimes that's sort of the space that I'm really trying to reflect on right now with the students I work with. And they don't have this sense that, when I was growing up, Ouija boards and things like that, boy, it's all scary stuff, stay away from that. You'd see a movie and it'd be really scary. I saw one of the Amityville horror movies with a friend when I was in high school. I think it is literally the last horror movie I've ever seen. I was so scared. We prayed all the way home. We were not praying boys, I can tell you. We were just scared to death. So I sort of withdrew from all of that, wanting to seek out spiritual things. But many of the students we work with today, they don't even necessarily see that as bad. The idea that they could conjure up something that's really real and that could really hurt them never occurs to them.
So that leads me to my last question. And as we said, 2 out of 3 Christians in the church, they hold some New Age worldview. New Age is so powerful that 1 out of 5 atheists hold some type of New Age worldview, which I think is astounding. But one thing I love about Summit is that you guys really focus on like purpose and truth and relationships. So what do you think are some key takeaways for Generation Z when it comes to truth, relationship, and this generation?
Well, I think you do have to teach truth in the context of a relationship. You have to show that my students are asking questions like, are you a good person? Do you have my best interests at heart? Can you help me grow? Can I trust you? And they are, at Summit now, we tell people, you hear about safe spaces on campus, for example. We tell them, we want our students to feel safe, to think, not safe from having to think.
Absolutely.
And that, I think that is a pretty critical difference. other things that we're seeing happen with Gen Z, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's a neurotic generation, but they're so much fun. I'm having more fun with the students that we work with now than I ever have,
Really?
because they seem much more open-hearted. They're a whole lot less likely to get in trouble, which makes it a lot easier on staff of our program. But I think we're finding the big question I'm asking at Summit with the students is, what are the barriers that would stop you personally from living a life that's fully committed to Jesus?
Yeah.
And we let that question hang all throughout the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Whereas in the old days, I would ask a question like that and then invite people to come forward to pray or to pray with their counselor, to just identify those barriers and just go to battle against them in prayer. We might have 5, 10, 15 students out of a couple hundred. Now I will have 75 to 150 out of 200 who will go for prayer, because they know they need to connect with something bigger than themselves. They know it's not true that they are the center of reality, which is what everything in the culture tells them and the way their parents treat them. But that they're wanting that connection with something bigger. And what we're praying, and we really spend a lot of time on this, we have pastors come over and we have a whole session on what is church? Why should you be part of church? Why should you be part of the body of Christ? Because in the me and Jesus equation, it's the me that's the problem.
Yeah. Me plus Jesus is not, doesn't equal Jesus.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Dr. Jeff, thank you so much for taking time out this evening.
Absolutely.
And it's such a pleasure to have authors, or an author that wrote one of my favorite books is a guy named Voltaire. And he wrote a book entitled Candide. And I don't speak French, so you can all correct me later on how that is supposed to be pronounced. But he wrote this book, Candide, but he has a quote. And Voltaire was a devout humanist, devout atheist. And in this quote he said, "There is no God, but don't tell my servant lest he murder me in the night." And this raises a serious question, that what happens when you remove God from the equation, or any deity? We have built our civilizations for the last several thousand years on the idea that someone bigger than us is handing us truth and asking us to live by it. So about 16.5 million Gen Z agree that what is morally right and wrong changes over time based on society. So society, as whims and desires change, that changes truth. 1 in 4 strongly agree what is morally right or wrong depends on what individuals believe. And some Christians believe that truth with a capital T is simply oppression. That you're simply oppressing people when you tell them that truth, that there is only absolute truth. So I want to welcome our next guest, Sarah Stonestreet. Give a big round of applause for Sarah. And she is going to help us unpack the postmodern worldview that had really gained steam in the 1980s in that third unraveling, but started a little bit sooner than that. And Sarah, I know I'm not supposed to say this.
Go for it.
But you're my preferred Stonestreet.
Where's John?
Don't make eye contact.
You mark that.
Well, just jumping right out of the gate, postmodernism is one of the most difficult subjects out there. I'll read books about it and I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what I just read. There's a guy named Ihab Hassan, and he is an expert on postmodernism, and he writes this: "I know less about postmodernism today than I did 30 years ago when I began to write about it." That's problematic. I mean, you know less about it today than 30 years ago. So since there's no agreement, I want to give you the impossible task, because I know you can do it, is tackling what is postmodernism. Can you help us understand what it is?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your confidence. And we're going to jump right into it. Because, I've thought about this for 30 years. Just written some books. No. It is hard to nail down. But there are some characteristics that I think will help us frame the conversation and also help us identify where we're seeing postmodernism. And so I'll just jump right into those. One is what Jean-Francois Lyotard, I'll tell you more French later, but he called it incredulity towards meta-narrative. And incredulity meaning disbelief, meta-narrative meaning a sweeping narrative that defines and describes the human condition.
So like the big story of humanity.
The big story. He says, nope, there's no big story. So without big story, you have no foundation for truth. Okay, so the incredulity towards meta-narrative. And in fact, postmodernists are suspicious of anyone that's offering a big story because they view that as a control mechanism. That anybody with a meta-narrative is actually just trying to control the weak. It's the powerful writing the story so they can control the weak.
So,
Go.
So this would even apply to the Bible in the sense because the Bible is a big story.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a meta-narrative from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
So, any thoughts on like the power dynamics of what Scripture brings and why they want to reject that?
Yeah, well, it is if from their lenses, it's a whole story of oppressors oppressing the oppressed, And so they want to reject that. Plus it says there's a truth, and they're saying, no, there's no truth. And so some implications of this, since there is no big story, and story is directly connected with identity, we're lost on our identity if we buy into this. And so we're left to latch on to small stories to create our identity. And so you see this and back to the oppressor and the oppressed. So that's kind of the narrative in all these stories. So some examples in culture would be, like two examples would be identity politics, where we group together based on our perceived identity or oppression, or transgenderism, which is going down even to the core of male and female and saying we even get to choose that because we're making our own identity. And then, of course, social media comes into this and provides the platform for creating our own identity, putting out to the world our own story, even though it may be totally different than the real story. But also, it gives us, it exacerbates the perceived injustices and gives us a platform to escalate those quickly. Okay, so that's one, meta-narrative. There's no meta-narrative.
Okay.
Two, there's no ultimate truth.
Okay.
And there's no way to know it. It's unknowable. And they would say that we are conditioned by our race and our gender and our culture and our religion. So we are way, way too biased to be able to identify any kind of truth. Number three would be, do you like all my notes?
I do like all your notes.
Okay, thanks. Number three would be, I have no idea the questions he's going to ask me, just so you know. I just kind of took notes.
This is just all off the cuff.
This is just off the cuff.
No previous emails, nothing.
Okay, number three, there is no standard for right and wrong. So there's no way to judge right and wrong. Michel Foucault was a 20th century French philosopher who said this very thing. There's no right and wrong. There's only the powerful setting norms to oppress the weak. And so he said, we need to get to the bottom of these social injustices that are happening and oppressing the weak. We need to figure out what these norms are and do away with them. And towards the end of his life, he veered his attention towards sexual norms. And he said, you know what, let's do away with those too. And so in his pursuit of his own freedom, in undoing sexual norms, he actually contracted and died from AIDS.
Wow.
So I have an appropriate quote for right now. Flannery O'Connor was a Catholic Southern author in the 20th century, mid-20th century. And she said, the Catholic novelist thinks that you, wait, let me get the wording right. The Catholic novelist believes that you destroy your freedom by sin, but the modern reader believes you gain it in that very way. I feel like that applies to some of the things, some of these throwing off of norms.
Yeah.
Thinking you're actually gaining freedom, you are actually forging your own fetters, which I can't remember who said that, but it wasn't my saying. But here's the thing, is that the 20th century was a brutal century. I mean, it promised all these things at the beginning, promised progress, it promised more advancement. In some cases, in some thinking, it promised utopia. And it was a century of great improvement in technology and science and math, but it was also brutal. It was the bloodiest century, and we've all heard that. And so about mid-century, when World War I and World War II are done, and people are like, hold up, like those promises aren't quite adding up, then skepticism took deep root, especially in Western civilization. And so that plays out on a popular level, and it plays out on a philosophical level. And so the average American that holds the postmodernist view doesn't sit around and read Of Grammatology by Derrida, or do you have that on your nightstand?
It's on my Kindle.
No. Okay. Or like think about Michel Foucault's ponderings. But what has happened is that those philosophies, as John says, have grown legs and walked into culture. That John's my husband, John's sister. I taught him everything he needs to know about this topic. Totally kidding. But anyway, so they've walked into our culture, they've dominated. And so there's this, okay, to quote John one more time, he calls it a cultural mood. There's like our culture has this postmodernist mood, this skepticism, and it's permeated our culture. And so anyway, it's on a popular and a philosophical level.
Wow. I think, so going into our next question, kind of the quote that you gave from John, his philosophy has grown legs and walked into culture. Like you said, nobody's sitting around reading the great minds of postmodernism, but what we see is how over time these ideas creep into our everyday life. We don't need to, we don't need to have the book dog-eared, or we don't need to that's postmodern. Like, we're not that aware of it as a society. And part of that, so we look at Gen Z, and 1 out of 3 say, sincerely believing something makes it true. Sincerely believing something makes it true. And I think a lot of us would respond and say, that's absurd. Like, I've sincerely believed a lot of things and failed my math test. I mean, I thought I had that one under control. I'm obviously not bitter about that math test. But how is this statement postmodernism? When a Gen Z person says sincerely believing something makes it true.
Yeah. Well, it's postmodernist because, first of all, it assumes there's not a big truth. There's not something that we can root truth in. And so truth is whatever you believe. Great. That's great for you, And it's based on interpretation, which we can talk about Derrida too if you want. But it's based on interpretation and experience of the individual. And then the other thing is the implications that has on morality are pretty huge.
Yeah.
Because you think we're kind of forced to go, if everybody's truth looks different, then we're either forced to go into little isolated small stories. Okay. Like, well, I'll just live my way, you live your way. Or it becomes a power struggle of, well, whose story's more powerful? Right. And they're the ones that win. But here's the thing about the small stories. You may think you can stay in your little small story, but your little small story and your little small truth is going to inevitably bump with someone else's that's going to be different. And so then that's where it becomes the power struggle. And we see this especially with sexual freedom in America right now, and well, in Western culture right now, because there's no way that we could have the sexual freedom that we have without bumping into each other. Well, I didn't mean that like that.
The eyes in my heart got really big. I kept a straight face
You did
after you
good.
said it.
Sorry. Get your mind out of the gutter, goodness. Okay, let me rephrase that. But sexual freedom that we're living in right now in our culture, the government has to step in and restrict freedom on other people. It just doesn't work because that just doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing in this secular crisis that we're in this crisis that we're in today, is that we're looking outside and we have to look to government institutions to legislate morality. And that's what that's what our society is asking them to do right now, is let's pass a law. Let's do this. Let's make sure our truth, whatever we collectively, as much power as we can get, make everybody else follow it. And so, Sarah, last question. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
That was a statement, that wasn't a question.
Oh, okay.
I just want to make sure. 2 out of 3 Gen Z believe it is not morally wrong to lie. Now, I find that astounding, concerning, disconcerting. What effect do you think postmodernism has on their relationships? Like, if it's not morally wrong to lie, how does that affect their relationships? And then, do you think that Gen Z can have authentic relationships if there's no mooring for truth, no foundation for truth?
Well, first of all, that is a problem that has permeated our culture for a long time.
Yeah.
So Gen Z inherited this problem. They didn't cause it.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
So it's true, but it's not necessarily particular to them, you know. But how is that wait, can you say that question one more time?
I sure
Sorry.
can.
The second part of it.
Can people have authentic relationships if there's no absolute truth?
Okay. Well, I would say that throughout history, as Christians and as cultures, we've always had to look and discern what are the lies our culture is believing and what are the idols that they're trying to replace God with. And so this is a roundabout answer. Okay, I'm coming back to that. But I think that in each generation, God has raised people that are able to speak truth and have authentic relationships, and in those relationships be able to speak truth and lead their contemporaries to the truth that brings life. And so I'm kind of excited about the posture that we're in, because you mentioned crisis, like we're in a crisis. And back to Flannery O'Connor, she would say, people accused her of writing grotesque and violent, like she has violence in her book, which is true, but not the grotesque part, but the violence. But she said, violence is never an end for a good writer, but it's often in violence that grace is offered and a choice has to be made. And I think the same is true in crisis.
Absolutely true.
That grace is offered. And I feel like that's the posture as Christians that we're in. We're in a posture to influence, because here we have a culture that's so confused, that's even confused about the fundamentals of male and female. Like, if we can go that confused, their identity is so off, that here we are. We have a big story that is life-giving, and it is true. And so I'm excited about this generation, because I think that through authentic relationships, and what Dr. Myers was saying about having authentic relationships is really important to this generation. And so we can't just give them facts. They get facts all day long through social media and all that, but we can have a conversation and we can speak to them in that way. So I'm excited because I think this next generation is poised to influence. And I'm excited to see how that happens. And so one thing I'm really concerned about with my own kids and with the kids that I interact with, their friends and in classes that I teach, is that they learn truth, but they also learn how to communicate in a winsome way. Because if you know truth and can't communicate it, okay,
Right.
what do you do? But if you can communicate it, boy, that influence is going to be to their neighbor, to their friends, to their institutions, to culture ultimately. So I'm excited to see where this crisis leads us, because I think it's a moment of grace.
I agree with you 100%. Let's give a big round of applause. Earlier, the topic of eugenics, pro-life, pro-abortion. This topic is one of the most divisive topics that we find ourselves in this crisis. And we find 7 out of 10 Generation Z, they believe that abortion is acceptable. And abortion is it's not a new battle. It's not a conversation from the 1970s. A lot of this actually began in the 1900s in America. And in the 1900s, we had figures like Margaret Sanger and others who wanted to practice something called eugenics. And I'm inviting our friend Megan Allman. She's with the, oh gosh, I just blanked out on the Life Training Institute. And she is going to come up and we're going to talk about eugenics a little bit more. Please give a big round of applause for Megan Allman.
Gosh, I still have nightmares about my geometry teacher making the whole class look at me and say, will someone please explain to Megan why because I said so is not a good enough proof for this geometry problem. It was like 2 a.m. homework that night.
I gave a speech in college, and we had to have like a credibility, like we had to give some credibility, and I said, and I'm Aaron Brown, and that's good enough. And then I passed. So that's what's important. So Megan, you are obviously well versed in the topic of pro-life and apologetics. Eugenics is truly a larger subject than solely abortion. Do you think that you could give us a brief overview of what eugenics is?
Yeah, sure. And anytime I talk about the topic of abortion, too, I tell people that in order to properly really talk about it, you have to dig up underneath it and see what's going on. So when we do that, we find the common ground, because I would say it's a purview of eugenics. Underneath abortion is kind of this lurking idea that's been around for a very long time, and it is the assumption that there are some human beings who matter more than other human beings. It's not a new idea. You could do a brief glance of history to see the way that it's manifested in societies prior to ours, but when we look at eugenics, we're seeing kind of the same idea taking place, if we would look up underneath it. Because each of the worldviews that we've mentioned tonight has an accompanying anthropology or an explanation of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And that idea strikes at the heart of that. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be valuable? Who counts and who gets to decide that? So eugenics, it has been around for a long time. We can look as far back for the idea as Plato, when he wrote about it in the Republic. But the word didn't really come around till late 19th century. Sir Francis Galton was the one who wrote it in a book of his. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and they shared more than just blood. They shared worldview ideas as well. So the main idea behind it was this hope that we could kind of harness humanity and create something better from it, or cleanse it in some way and get rid of things like disease and sickness. But also these unwanted traits, or these things that were considered less than. And so in the early 20th century in America, that came about through things like sterilization. I remember the court case, Buckford versus Bell was one that happened in like 1927, I think it was, involved a young girl who was sterilized, and once that was passed, there were around 70,000 who followed that. So it was kind of crazy things happening. Eugenics is most widely known when we think about people like Hitler and World War II and the Nazis, who were trying to take this idea to its extreme, of course, and kill off individuals who possess these arbitrary, unwanted traits, in this case being Jewish or being disabled. So the idea there manifested in such a way that 11 million people
Right.
lost their lives. So after World War II, it really kind of lost momentum in talking about it overtly. But it's still very present today in things like you were describing with abortion. It really has to do with the technologies that we have and the desire to kind of make humanity better and have this ideal human existence, as it were. And really a lot of that has to do with kind of taking control of procreative material and reproductive material.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. Over the decades, and we're kind of saying it right now, these ideas of eugenics kind of creep and kind of keep going. Even to the point today where we argue, well, when is a person a person?
Yeah.
Are there some other areas of eugenics where we've seen this creep throughout the past few decades?
Absolutely, and we can really pick up from really Jeff and Sarah's talks on the two worldviews we looked at. Jeff was talking about kind of post-enlightenment and the secularism that came in. Francis Schaeffer would have called that the fact-value split that happened within secularism. So secularism itself split in two. Bottom rung there is what we had is people who kind of considered science the basis of all that is real. These were your materialists. And then the top rung were those who reacted to that and said, no, can't stand that world, don't want to live in that world. So they made values the basis of all that is real. But they bought the premise that came out of the Enlightenment, which is values are subjective. So we have some who would see humanity as purely materialistic, these anthropologies again. Human beings are just stuff, just physical, which kind of creates some crazy issues when you think about if I'm nothing more than my physical parts and there's no real dignity or underlying immaterial self to me, then what's the big deal about experimentation or trying to better or manipulate? With those who would hold values as the basis of all that is real, that even came about in a way, especially with abortion and what we see here. My values are the basis of what is real, so I can define reality in different ways, even going so far as to rewrite biological reality.
Right.
And so, yes, what we see from those anthropologies, both of which are kind of driving the discourse today, not the Christian anthropology, but those, are things like abortion. Abortion, of course, now that we have the ability to do prenatal testing and prenatal diagnosis and find these diseases, the idea coming about of when we want to rid the world of disease, but the answer to that right now is to rid the world of the individual who carries the disease. We can take that as far back as artificial reproductive technologies, where we have pre-implantation screening and pre-implantation diagnosis, looking for faulty embryos who are human beings, who are then discarded through selective termination, which is abortion. And then we can go as far as looking at genetic testing, where we're looking for these genetic markers, these problems that people may or may not have. Now, there is some good in that, because what if we did have the ability to cure some diseases, things like cystic fibrosis and things that we found to be purely genetic? That would be wonderful, but technology always comes with unintended consequences. And when driven by worldview, we can see crazy things can happen, such as with reproductive technologies, children begin to look like commodities. Things that we can put together and piece together. We can look at the other end of the spectrum, things like euthanasia, which comes from that view of if we're going to define what a person is based on values, or if they're no longer of use to us, then of course the idea being they're a drain on society at the end of life, and we can therefore kill them. It has just the things that these truths are communicating to people in the disabled community, so the front end, the beginning of life issues like Down syndrome, and then the end of life issues, those who begin to take that language of right to die and begin to see it as a duty to die. It's really, really terrible. But
what was the movie that came out a few years ago? It involved, I think the story went that it was a guy who was kind of playboy, was driving his car really fast.
Me Before You.
Me Before You. And my understanding is he was paralyzed from the neck down, and the movie for the most part is about trying to figure out his life and getting a sense of his life back.
Yeah.
But at the very end, spoiler alert, he chooses to end his life, and that had a very big backlash. with the disabled community, because they felt the movie communicated that their lives, like you said, duty to die instead of a right to life in that instance.
Yeah, there's a lot that feeds into that. Master of my own destiny, autonomous individuals. Then at the end of that spectrum that I was mentioning, we have also the transhumanist movement, who takes this whole idea of trying to make humanity better by surpassing human nature altogether. So all these ideas feeding in, and we can do a whole lot, but should we? Comes back to that question.
Yeah. Just because you can, should you? Last question for the night. So 1 out of 3 Gen Z believe abortion is wrong, which means 2 out of 3 Gen Z believe abortion is fine. You are boots on the ground. You are in high schools frequently and meeting with people and working with different groups. In your experience, what has been one of the most helpful tools that you have used to help young people see the sacredness of life?
Yeah. Well, just a word about the young people that I work with, and similar to, I think, Jeff and Sarah, I've had very similar experience with them. They are hugely energetic. They are compassionate. They have exposure to what's going on all around the world. They want to solve problems. Like young people I talk to talking about wanting to dig wells in Africa. When I was younger, I don't think I was even thinking about how to help my next door neighbor, which doesn't say a lot about me. But so they're interesting to work with in that way and exciting to work with in that way. And I think in a lot of ways, because of things being so up in the air with these worldviews that they're kind of inundated with, they really just want something that is grounded. When it comes to the abortion issue in particular, and all the others we mentioned could be related back to this. Moral relativism, coming particularly from the postmodern worldview, the idea we don't ground morality in anything like Sarah was talking about, that's a huge stumbling block with abortion in particular, with these issues in particular. I think there are reasons for that, but sometimes just pointing out to the students that I'm working with that we think this way about abortion, but we don't think this way about other issues where that idea, some human beings matter more than others, is at play and causing injustice. And these are issues they deeply care about and should. Racism, sex trafficking, slavery around the world, women's rights globally, all these different things kind of play off of that idea manifesting in ways. But with abortion, it's, oh no, that's your truth. So I sometimes will give them the example. There's a bumper sticker that exists that says, oh, you don't like abortion, don't have one. And that's more relativistic language, as if it's a preference issue. Francis Beckwith would say, what if that bumper sticker said, oh, you don't like slavery? Well, don't own one. Oh, you don't like spousal abuse? Well, then don't beat your spouse. Sometimes it's just making that connection to show that the kind of conversation we're about to have about abortion isn't a relativistic conversation. It's, to capital T, true. The other thing that I think really reaches them, because we live in a society that values people functionally, and that's the whole driving force behind eugenics, is this, I'm going to choose an arbitrary reason to say that human beings matter, and we're going to go with that, whoever's in the position of power. I think students kind of buy into that on a day-to-day, and we all do to some degree, because we all live in the same culture. When we wake up on days and we just don't feel worthy that day, maybe we're having a bad hair day, or we didn't get enough likes on Instagram, or whatever it is. It could be other things. Things aren't going well at work. You didn't perform well on a test. The sporting event that you were a part of didn't go well. You had a fight with someone. Like all these things that we try to look at and balance, like I want to matter. And these are the things that dictate that. When we're able to peel it back and show that even philosophically speaking, the best answer to the question, why are human beings valuable, is they're intrinsically valuable. That means you matter just because you're human.
And just the way you are.
That's it. So if they can grab hold of that idea, which is firmly rooted in the Christian worldview, in the Imago Dei, they have the potential to really become the kind of young people that the world can't really define. And if they can grab hold of that vision, as Sarah was talking about, if we can tell them that better story about themselves, and they can begin doing that for the others around them, they become very dangerous to this world in a good way, because the world doesn't know what to do with people like that. I think that story, which is true of them, is, I think that's attractive to them. I think it's a beautiful story. So if they can understand that there's a better story about them than the one that they're believing, and how that fits into the larger story, then that really connects with them too. But that comes from the philosophy stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. Let's give Megan a big round of applause.
My first question right out of the chute is, and I saw this in your research, you referenced Michael Novak's book, The Secular Saint, and he states, the quest for human values in our society has moved outside the church. So, somebody that has done extensive work on this, can you tell us what was happening to mainline denominations in America with words like Michael Novak's?
Yes, I can. So as you mentioned in kind of discussing this generation theory, in the decades leading up to the 1960s, mainline Protestants, or what some historians call liberal Protestants or ecumenical Protestants, these are kind of interchangeable terms. We can use the term mainline, but sort of growing out of this longer tradition of religious liberalism in the United States that extends back to the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. They had always kind of evidenced this really profound concern for societal issues and for the development of these human values. So they've always been very outward looking in attempting to sort of address society's ills, asking, okay, how can the church address these things and transform society? A lot of this is in line with these kind of progressive political views and turns we see at the beginning of the 20th century. And this works for several decades. This is sort of the view that these sort of mainline denominations are espousing. And especially, as you mentioned, in the wake of World War II, we see this kind of global crisis. And so we see this renewed emphasis on asking questions like, okay, how does our faith inform the way we develop values in society, the way we pursue freedom? How does this help us grapple with what is the meaning of life in the wake of all this devastation and this all this war and conflict? And so they're sort of attempting to offer theologically based or kind of church-related answers to these things. But what we see in the 1960s is we see all of these kind of societal tensions escalate in a new way, not necessarily just globally, but also sort of at their front doorstep, so to speak. So we see mounting tensions with the civil rights movement. This is becoming increasingly visible. You turn on your television, and as in no time before, television's a relatively new technology. You see these things in your living room. You're sort of watching in horror as the conflict in Vietnam escalates. Cold War is looming in the background. And so for many of these mainline Protestants, who again come from this tradition of caring about and wanting to address these social issues, for the first time, many of them are asking the question, has our approach thus far been adequate? And many of them are driven to the conclusion that if sort of these decades of trying to approach these things through maybe kind of theologically based advances in society, to many of them, these approaches of the past decades seem simply inadequate. So many of them are driven to come to the conclusion that perhaps churches themselves are unnecessary, and perhaps the answer is moving outside of the churches and simply advancing good in society. Perhaps it's religion, perhaps it's theology, perhaps it's dogma that is holding us back from sort of transforming society. Because clearly, if our approach would have been effective, we wouldn't be seeing these really kind of tumultuous conflicts in the United States and in the world.
Maybe you can help us understand belief. Like, what are we missing where we're going from there's a God, his kingdom is coming to earth, to God's probably dead. It's so we're going to pick up the mantle of bringing a kingdom to earth.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, certainly. So It's funny, yeah, you mentioned sort of Nietzsche in that, because in the 1960s we see a movement arise that's called the Death of God movement, and this is quite radical. So I certainly don't want to give the impression that like the vast majority of mainline Protestants are actually subscribing to like every sort of tenet of Death of God theology. In fact, many of them sort of hold it at arm's length, but I think it's really helpful because while it is a more radical manifestation of this kind of cultural moment of these questions, I do think it's reflective of many of the concerns and questions of Americans in general, but specifically mainline Protestants, maybe liberal Protestants during this time. So yeah, it sort of contends that when Jesus died on the cross, his spirit left the earth, and so humanity is simply left. And so it's sort of, a lot of it actually draws upon and interprets the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which took a couple of decades, although he was writing in the 30s and 40s, took a couple of decades to sort of make it over into kind of mainstream American theology. But they're taking his ideas of this religionless Christianity, of a world come of age, so sort of a humanity that maybe in its childhood and its infancy needed religion, needed church in order to mature and form, that it had now by the 1960s matured, and that the ultimate kind of teleological goal of human history was to outgrow the garment of religion and to outgrow the need for the church. So this is this mature man coming of age, so to speak. So often they speak of the ultimate goal of Christianity being freedom, including freedom from religion itself. And obviously this is quite radical. As I said, not everyone is subscribing to every tenet, but it addresses for many of these mainline Protestants sort of this tension between how do I sort of hold this faith, but also address these incredibly sort of pressing social issues. And it's a theology that lends itself very well to sort of social activism, which is why I think it gains kind of such a foothold during this cultural moment. So we may have many who aren't fully subscribing to this, but who do are sort of very receptive to this idea that the church and the church's dogma and teaching may not be necessary to be the church in the world.
That is amazing. I'm so glad Jesus came to deliver us from Jesus.
It's a little extreme. And I should mention too, this is a departure for these liberal Protestants, because this stream of kind of liberal Protestantism until this time sort of stood as a middle ground between conservatism, whether that be political or theological, and radicalism. So there's actually if you want to call it a conservative streak within liberalism, in that it typically thrives within institutions, whether they be religious or political. So sort of they do have a stake in maintaining that status quo and maintaining these institutions, not radically doing away with them, but it's always thrived within these. So this is a departure that is quite radical, or you talk about that turning point in the 60s, where we see for the first time some of these liberal Protestants willing to maybe jettison their attachment to these denominations or religious institutions.
I just think it's crazy. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Just amazing. So with the diminishment of the main line, so I pulled some stats a while back, and like the Methodist Church specifically, they had a merger, had the largest numbers I think they'd ever had in 1967, maybe 1968, but it has been steadily declining over the last 50 or so years. What is maybe one positive outcome to the diminishment of mainline, and what do you think may be one negative outcome to the diminishment of mainline Christianity?
Yeah, so I hope I'm not answering this in too roundabout of a way, but this sort of gets at something that I think is positive. I think it's important that we see the diminishment of these kind of mainline denominations in context. So when we look at the numbers, it looks like the diminishment sort of happens at the exact same time that evangelicalism in the 1970s is ascending. And so it sort of, for many historians initially, it created this perception that, oh, are these folks in the pews just fleeing these mainline denominations in mass? This kind of mass exodus to evangelical denominations. And we realize there's kind of more at play there. So one of the reasons we see this decline in number is that mainline Protestants have far lower birth rates than evangelicals. So they simply sort of aren't replacing themselves in the ways that evangelicals, who tend to be much more prolific, are sort of replacing their ranks there. And there are all these other demographics. So we see a lot more immigration after the late 1960s. So part of that is that mainline denominations are simply a smaller piece of the American religious pie. So all that to say, there are many factors at play there. But so many historians sort of stress, okay, this isn't simply the result of like this failure of mainline denominations. But the component of this that's closest to a failure that many scholars identify is the inability of liberal Protestantism to retain its young people after this kind of college young adult age, which is what I study specifically. And so what I think, if we can talk about this in terms of a good thing, I'll have to take off my objective historian hat here. But I think what this reveals is, it helpfully reveals the danger of linking any type of religious or theological identity to a political movement. So we see this is what happens with many of these mainline or liberal Protestant youth, kind of college students and young adults in the 1960s. We see them slowly but surely sort of jettison any type of theological or orthodox kind of Christian identity as their unifying principle, and rather sort of rallying around these political and social causes, which isn't bad in and of itself. Like, if we have a holistic faith, it should inform the way we interact with neighbors and strangers and think about politics and culture and all of these things. But again, their unifying principle and the source of their primary identity cease to be anything based in sort of religion or theology whatsoever. And so when these social movements, when these political causes crumble or explode at the end of the 1960s, there's no sort of unifying resources from which to draw, no theological resources from which to draw, no Christian identity, nothing that makes their Christianity distinctive in any way from maybe the nonprofit down the street or the other activist down the street. So they've sort of jettisoned any Christian distinctiveness whatsoever. And so while this is maybe for many of us sort of a sad tale, I think it helpfully illustrates the importance of keeping this Christian distinctiveness apart from any type of particular political or social agenda. And that can be on the left or on the right. This sort of runs the spectrum here. And again, not that our faith doesn't inform and sometimes even drive the way we engage with these things, but it underscores the importance of maintaining this Christian distinctiveness, this theological distinctiveness from the rest of the world.
Galvan.